Today we're going to be discussing the ethical implications of how we treat one another as human beings. These are pressing questions, particularly at a time when medical costs are rising and increasing numbers of people are in need of services. How do we decide who gets treated and who does not? Who makes the decisions, and what are the standards we follow? This is nothing less than the question of life and death for each one of us.
I was the SOD, surgeon of the day, and the nurse said, "Doc, we got a very badly injured guy out here. You better come out right away." So I went out and took a look at him, and he was lying in a stretcher, and he was really badly injured. And I talked to him, and he said, "Well, I think I left my legs in the helicopter, Doc." You might just as well have left them in the helicopter because they're no good. He needed to have both lower extremities amputated. He needed, as we found out from radiograms, what had gone in here was now inside his skull, so in his frontal lobe, so he needed a craniectomy and debridement of his brain, and he needed to have this eye taken out. And so he needed the urologist, we needed the neurosurgeon, the orthopedic surgeon, myself, and we went to work. Well, after we'd finished, the chief of professional services, a lieutenant colonel, when he put his arm around me and said, "I think you should know that the boys think maybe you should have let that fellow go last night." I was sort of, oh my God, I never even thought of that.
At the foundation of our thinking about ethics is the basic principle that every human being possesses a profound, inherent, and equal dignity and a right to life.
How do we adapt the concept that all life is precious and all human beings are equal before God in this new world?
Either we are going to stick at the basis of our ethics and at the base of our medicine with the proposition that every human being has profound, inherent, and equal dignity, or we're going to abandon that in favor of the view that was once associated with the movement known as eugenics.
The eugenics movement did not go away. It really changed how it expressed itself. When we engage in something like that, we have already subscribed to utilitarian calculus that says it's okay to let us use genetic information to determine whether some people can exist for the use of others or don't have the right to exist at all.
Are we willing to sacrifice the lives of some human beings for the sake of others? And that means, are we willing to give up the sanctity of human life ethic in favor of an ethics of eugenics?
A proper understanding of who the human person is and what the person is in relationship to others and to society. If we lose that, and we are losing that, it becomes very, very dangerous, especially for certain groups, the unborn, the elderly.
I think this discussion is the most important one you can engage in ethics today. Unfortunately, a lot of people put slogans and catchphrases like pro-life, pro-choice. It's much deeper than that. The question is, what does it mean to be human?
And we'll try to answer that in the next 10 minutes. I'm delighted to have a chance to be on the platform with this distinguished group of folks, and was particularly thrilled to have been a part of the Do the Right Thing video series. Grateful to Chuck for your vision for that and for the partnership that we at Biola University have with the Colson Center in distributing a lot of our scholarship and academic work here. What I want to do for just a couple minutes is to highlight what I perceive to be as an erosion in respect for what Professor George referred to as essential intrinsic human dignity and respect for the sanctity of life. Because I think you can see it in virtually every area of bioethics that's under discussion today. Let me highlight just a handful of things that hopefully will bring this point home to you. As I'm sure you're aware, there are still roughly 1.5 million abortions done every year and have been since 1973. God bless the pro-life movement. As hard as we have tried to overturn Roe v. Wade, I don't think that is likely any time in our lifetime to see that overturned. And as much as the grassroots efforts have been engaged in by the pro-life movement significantly over the last 3 decades, we are really no closer to seeing the incidence of abortion significantly reduced than we were 30 years ago. Today, actually, the debate has taken on what I would consider to be a bit of an ominous turn, where the advocates of liberal abortion rights are actually conceding that human beings, unborn human beings, are full persons, and yet justifying the right for pregnant women to take the lives of their full person unborn children. We have a profound ambivalence in the culture at large about what kind of a thing the unborn child actually is. If you've read the newspaper at all, you've seen some very celebrated accounts about how people who have been guilty of killing pregnant women are charged not with one murder but with 2. The case of Scott Peterson, who murdered his wife Lacey and their unborn child with whom she was 8 months pregnant, is a good example of that. He is now serving a jail term for both of those murders, not just one. And you wonder if the very same day that Lacey Peterson was killed, she could have been en route to an abortion clinic to have her 8-month pregnancy ended via a partial birth abortion, fully legal. And you wonder, well, what's the difference? How do you account for that kind of goofy ambivalence in our culture, in our respect for the unborn? And here's where it is. The law protects unborn children only as long as they are wanted, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is far more a commentary on the mother than it is on the unborn child, and raises a really interesting question that I haven't heard anybody press yet in our politically correct culture, but I think it's worth putting forward, that if women can refuse to take responsibility for children that they don't want, if mothers who are carrying their offspring can refuse to take responsibility for children who are unwanted, then why can't the fathers do the same thing? Why do we force fathers for full child support whether they want the child or not? Now, I think they ought to be taking responsibility for their children, don't get me wrong on that. But what that illustrates is this ambivalence and huge hypocritical inconsistency in the culture that is generated by our ambivalence toward what kind of a thing an unborn child is. We have, as John pointed out with that Philadelphia abortion doctor, things that a generation ago were considered absolutely unthinkable now appear on the front pages of our newspaper. A generation ago, it was unthinkable that a teenage girl could give birth at the prom, shove her baby in the garbage bin in the restroom, and then go back out and enjoy the rest of the prom. It would have been unthinkable to even have to debate legislation like the Born Alive rule that require that is a law, a federal law that requires physicians, if they botch abortions, not to go ahead and finish it off. That if the child is born alive, then every attempt must be made to save the child's life. Who thought that kind of a law would actually be necessary today? Yet our headlines tell us that it most certainly is. Throughout university campuses today, and we saw this where we filmed the series at Princeton. We were just down the street from Peter Singer's office, who has given us probably the most sophisticated academic defense of infanticide. He's actually being quite consistent with his views of what constitutes a human person. But Singer actually advocates infanticide for any reason up to the first 30 days after birth, analogous to the way abortion laws work today. Let me give you another example of this. The way we regard human embryos today, I would consider to be the most vulnerable among our population today. Human embryos are largely considered by our culture to be clumps of cells that you have to look under a microscope to see and can't possibly be a human person. Yet you ask a couple who has had in vitro fertilization infertility treatments and had children that they are holding in their arms today, who just a few months before were embryos in the lab. And they know instinctively, they know intuitively that there's a connection, an intrinsic connection between those embryos in the lab and those bouncing baby children that they're holding in their arms today. And I think they get it about the moral and ontological status of human embryos as human persons as well. And in our culture today, where embryonic stem cell research is going ahead, full speed ahead, we are in the kind of environment that Professor George referred to, where we are sacrificing the lives, not just of a handful of human beings, but of tens of thousands of human beings, simply to benefit others among us. We have at the other end of life too. I would suggest that not only are embryos and the unborn some of the most vulnerable among us, but also the elderly today. With increasing number of states either passing or considering laws to legalize assisted suicide, and in many parts of Europe, euthanasia without consent is becoming far more the norm. Most empirical studies that have been done in places in Europe, for example, that have legalized assisted suicide and euthanasia report that somewhere between 15 to 20% of all cases of euthanasia are euthanasia done without consent. The Dutch actually some time ago coined a term for this. They called it crypthanasia, where it refers to euthanasia done cryptically, not only without consent, but in most cases without the knowledge of the patient who is being assisted in taking their own life. And Chuck and others who have mentioned the eugenics coming is nothing new with that, and mentioning some of the Nazi analogies for euthanasia and assisted suicide. Although I would suggest that the Nazi euthanasia program never began with any kind of beneficent purpose. It was always for eugenic reasons, and so I would say the Nazis started at the bottom of the slippery slope and then slipped further downhill. But that being said, today, the arguments for euthanasia, for legalizing assisted suicide, do have some disturbing things in common with the way it was articulated in the 1920s and 30s. One is the idea that there could be a distinction between a human being and a person, that not every human being was considered a person with full rights to life. And then second, the idea that there could be such a thing as a life that was not worth living, a life that was not worth sustaining and maintaining. Both of those were a part of the ethos of the euthanasia program in Germany around World War II, and we hear those same kind of arguments being made today. It also affects the way we view those with genetic and physical challenges and disabilities. In the very first segment on this, you heard from Johnny Erickson Tada. And she's had firsthand experience in this area, and she is one of our strongest advocates for the right to life of a person regardless of their ability to function. And we have a very interesting thing going on today in many of our prenatal clinics where prenatal genetic testing is done. Usually, if a couple has a normal pregnancy and they choose to abort the child, the burden of proof is on them to explain why on earth they would want to do that. But something very interesting happens if you undergo genetic testing and get bad news back on a genetic test, is that burden of proof reverses. And it's very damaging to our view of those with physical and genetic challenges. Because once you get bad news back on a genetic test, it is assumed that you will end that pregnancy. And the burden of proof, interestingly, is on the couple to justify why they want to continue nurturing their unborn child. A very subtle shift, but one that I think reflects an erosion in our respect for intrinsic human dignity and the intrinsic value of life. Now, eugenics is back in a wide variety of ways. We have a number of ways in which we can choose the gender of our children, and is being done in alarming rates around the world. Just 10 years ago, in places like China and India, the imbalance between the numbers of males and females was something on the order of 108 males for every 100 females. Today, with gender selection technology going full speed ahead in most parts of the world, that gender balance is now roughly 126 males for every 100 females. And there is a demographic landslide of unattached males that is coming in the next generation that I think that nobody talks much about, but is a direct result, it seems to me, of our eugenic movements. We can choose for traits. Egg donor, Frank, you're quite right about that. In fact, I saw an ad that said just that very thing in a college newspaper. If you are on a state university college campus, I don't think we have those ads in the Chimes here as far as I'm aware, but you will see ads for egg donors and surrogates, and women are offered lots and lots of money, and couples can actually choose the traits of their donors that will go into the child that they don't want to procreate, they want to manufacture. Another subtle, I think, undercut at the intrinsic human dignity that we all have. We are also seeing examples of how people are using genetic technologies in a kind of an odd eugenics way. Instead of selecting out for disabilities, some couples are actually selecting in for disabilities, and using genetic technologies and genetic testing in order to have a child with a disability instead of produce one that's not. And that's a scary prospect in my view. It seems to me that what this comes down to is precisely the question that Professor George raised on the clip that you just saw, is what does it mean to be human? Or to put it a little differently, who is a member of the human community? Who qualifies for membership and on what basis? This is why the culture has a really difficult time answering this, which is why we see the ambivalence that we do in the law. And the reason for that is that this question is not fundamentally a scientific one, though it is an insulin question. It's not a matter of preference, but it's not one that can be settled scientifically. I was debating this some time ago on a university campus, and the scientist on the panel actually conceded this point, that the definition of a human person is not a scientific question. I nearly fell out of my seat. It's the first time I'd ever had that point conceded. But then where he went with that was really troubling. Because in his view, if it wasn't settled scientifically, then anybody's view on this was as good as the next person's. And I was the one all of a sudden who was imposing this religious view of what a human person is on the rest of the group. When I suggested to him that no, actually he was imposing just as rigid a view of what a human person was as I was. It was just which one of us had the better argument. It wasn't a matter of just whose opinion counted for more. The question of who's a member of the human community is set in a philosophical and ultimately a theological context. Because if we are not human beings created in God's image, then the question of human dignity is an oxymoron. Because there is no such thing. And the communist regimes throughout most of the 20th century, who had the most flagrant abuses of human rights, were actually acting entirely consistently with their ideology. And if we are simply the result of time and chance and genetic mutations and evolutionary forces, then we have no reason to think that human beings are anything else but insignificant blips on a cosmic screen. And we have no reason to care about the dignity of any of us, not to mention the unborn and the elderly and the most vulnerable among us. So it's only if we set this in the context of our theological view, our theological assertion, which I think we can defend philosophically very ably, that we are special, unique creations in the image of God with intrinsic dignity, that this discussion even has a chance of going forward. Now, in trying to articulate this to a culture that looks at us like we're nuts for believing in things like human nature and the image of God, is a little bit trickier proposition. So let me just give you a brief suggestion on how to go about this. I did this when I was debating embryonic stem cell research at a hospital system some time ago, and people were coming from all across the board in terms of their worldviews. But I tried to explain it something like this, that our common sense views of a human person suggest that a person is something that you are, not something that you do. Okay? We call this in philosophical circles, we say that human beings are substances that have an internal defining essence and a continuity of personal identity that exists through time and change. Okay, now let me spell out what I mean by that. Is our entire view of criminal justice and moral responsibility is premised on human beings being seen as a substance with an essence, a nature. Because if we are not, if a human person is nothing more than a collection of parts and properties, then I could go out and commit a crime today, and if I'm not brought to trial for that for a year from now, I could plausibly claim that I am a different entity than the person who committed the crime. Are you with me on that? Now, you're laughing, and rightly so, because a judge would laugh far more vigorously than you are, and that view would be correctly laughed out of court, because our common sense views underlying criminal justice tell us that human persons have a continuity of identity that exists through time and through change. And it doesn't matter how we change. I mean, if I lose half my brain, I would not be half of myself. I would still be all of myself, but with half the brain function. Those are two very different things. And so it's really important to see a difference between being a person and functioning as a person. Okay? Most people in our culture want to define who counts in the human community by virtue of their ability to perform a certain set of functions. that you have self-consciousness, self-awareness, awareness of your environment, a capacity for relating to another person, so that people who are unborn or people who are in comas at the end of life would clearly not count as persons. Right? That's the philosophical way that our culture demeans the intrinsic dignity of persons. But if you think about it, we are far more than how we function. In fact, if we are nothing more than our ability to perform those functions, if that determines our membership in the human community, then that's bad news for every one of us in here who's ever been under general anesthesia, right? If the anesthesia worked like it was supposed to, you don't have any of those functions. Right? Now, the critic will come back and say, well, but that's only temporary. Anesthesia wears off. It's like a reversible coma. It's done. It's just temporary. But they don't realize they've just shot themselves in the foot by making that counter-argument. Because what they're admitting is that something else, they're not saying what it is, but something else besides the ability to perform those functions is what gives you your status as a person even under general anesthesia. Though if it's strictly function-oriented, it makes no sense at all to do that. See, what we'd say is that being a person is an all or nothing thing, not a more or less thing. In philosophy, we call that a degreed property, and being a person is not a degreed property, or else those of us who are on the wrong side of the bell curve, and that's very bad news for us, because our rights and protectability would erode as our ability to perform those critical functions would also erode. And I'm so with Professor George and what we affirmed in the film series that this is one of the cutting edges and one of the places that I think is easiest to see the source of our confusion when it comes to ethics and morality. We must safeguard the intrinsic dignity of every human person as created in God's image, regardless of our abilities to perform certain functions. Thank you.